Just a fair warning before the video begins. This video will not be spoiler free. I'll be going over my thoughts of this book, including spoilers. Logen Ninefingers, infamous barbarian, has finally run out of luck. Caught up in one feud too many, he's about to become a dead barbarian, leaving nothing behind but bad songs and dead friends. Jezal Dan Luthar, paragon of selfishness, has nothing more dangerous in mind than winning glory in the fencing circle, but war is brewing, and on the battlefield of the frozen north they fight by altogether bloodier rules. Inquisitor Golkta, crippled turned torturer, would like little better than to see Jezal come home in a box, but then he hates everyone. Cutting treason out the heart of the Union one confession at a time leaves little room for friendships, and his latest trail of corpses can lead straight to the rotten heart of the government, if he can just stay alive long enough to follow it. So, making a video today about a book that I've had on my shelf for a long time, that I finished quite a while ago, and that is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. I'm going to gush about this book for an indeterminate amount of time. I love this book. This book was amazing. Yeah. This book has special meaning to me because at my last year of university, I was diagnosed with depression about 6 months after university. I've never had a dark period of my life, to be honest with you. I think I was depressed the whole time. I think I've been depressed for a very long time, and I hadn't realised it. I didn't know that I was. And one thing for me, looking back, that was kind of an obvious indicator of that was that I had a massive passion for reading throughout all of my childhood. And I picked this book up when I was 15, 16, and I kind of read a bit of it and I just couldn't get into it. And then I went into this massive reading slump, and all I did was play video games like 3 years straight basically, and I didn't have any desire to read. And that really should have been a bit of a signifier that something was wrong, but I was an emotionally immature teenager, so I didn't think anything was wrong. And now after university I've gone and I've read it, and I've finished it, and I kind of saw this book on my shelf as kind of a representation of where I was mental health wise, and I kind of thought to myself that I would pick this book up when I felt like I was in a much better place, and I picked it up and I blitzed the whole thing. So I think that kind of closes the door on that whole thing. I can say that this book, unlike the first time I read it, where I just did not give a shit, I read probably about the first third of it, gripped me from page 1, and I love it, and like I said, I'm going to gush about it, and I cannot wait to read the next one. So, The Blade Itself, how to describe this book? It is kind of as if A Song of Ice and Fire met Quentin Tarantino. It's kind of how I'm going to describe it, and it's quite a grimdark fantasy story, which usually isn't my kind of thing. Darkness for the sake of darkness isn't usually something that I really am interested in. I usually prefer a more kind of thematics where the light and the dark in the world are kind of contrasting one another, and there is good and there is bad. I definitely like moral ambiguity. Not to say that that's not a thing that I'm not into. I am, but usually it's not usually the kind of thing I would go for. So I was really surprised by this book when it turned out to be one of my favourite books, one of the best books I've ever read. And I think the reason for that is because this book does something that so few authors do really, and that is write a totally character-driven story. There is almost no plot in this book whatsoever. The three main characters very early in get set on a path, and they walk it. But this isn't a path that's given to them, it's a path of their own making. It's their path, the road that they kind of feels like they were meant to walk as a result of their own decisions. Especially in the case of Logan, the position he's in is 100% his own fault. Golkta literally could have done anything with his life after the war and chose to become a torturer, and Jezal just straight up chose to basically go into fencing. So the characters they have a lot of agency within this book. Everything feels they're not forced into the story. Like the characters aren't jammed into this mold of following this plot that's beyond their control. And towards the end, it becomes clear that they are being manipulated by forces beyond their understanding, but that is done in such a way that it doesn't feel like it takes their agency from them. And there's something about the way the characters navigate this world that feels so realistic, feels so close to life. They don't feel like they're even part of a story. You just feel like you're watching these people live in this world and go through events in their life. And it's really interesting because the writing in this book is completely character based, completely character driven, and nobody writes characters like Joe Abercrombie. This guy writes characters in a way that I've never seen before. It follows three main characters. It follows Logen Ninefingers, who was a champion of basically a now king on his rise to power. Golkta, who was once a war hero but was captured and tortured and eventually released, his body completely broken and destroyed by the experience, then goes on to use that intimate knowledge of what works during torture to become a torturer himself. And Jezal, who is just kind of an asshole, he's a nobleman, who kind of actually has a really great character arc in this book. But there are also other viewpoint characters. There's Major West, the Dogman, and Ferro. Major West is basically just an old subordinate of Golkta. He's a commoner, and since the end of a recent war, the one that caused Golkta to be in the situation he's in, basically he rose through the ranks in the military, and he's the first commoner to reach the level of prestige that he has. And there's a lot of upset people within the world who do not like a commoner being in that position, Jezal included, who's one of his friends. The Dogman is an old member of Logan's crew, who Logan believed to have died and is not actually dead. And then Ferro, who is a Gurkish slave who is basically trying to get revenge for what was done to them when they were a slave. So yeah, there's quite a lot of viewpoint characters. The three primary viewpoint characters are Logan, Golkta, and Jezal, and they're the characters mentioned on the back in the blurb that I read earlier. And the way Joe Abercrombie writes characters, it's like every author obviously tries to have each character have this unique character voice, right? Joe Abercrombie does this unlike anyone else I've ever seen. It's incredible. Every character feels so realized just through the uniqueness of the text that's used to represent their viewpoint. So sometimes you'll start a chapter and you'll know whose perspective it's from immediately, basically. I mean, one of the things about Golkta is Golkta has a lot of internal monologuing, because the way he presents himself and the way he acts externally are completely different. So we see the real Golkta through this internal monologuing. With Logan, he's very perceptive, and he's repeatedly talking about things in the environment. It's really interesting because And then Jezal, for example. Sorry, I'm missing Jezal. Jezal almost always talks about himself as much as possible. Usually, if a chapter starts and it starts talking about putting someone down immediately, it's Jezal. Jezal is constantly putting people down. He's constantly bigging himself up. He's constantly moaning about things not being the way they should, about him having to be equals to people who should be when he should be their betters. And it's like you know immediately what character it is, whose perspective you're reading from, almost before you're aware within the text who it actually is. And no one writes like this. No, I've never seen anything like it. No one writes like Joe Abercrombie. It's crazy. And the prose. Oh my god, the prose. The way he writes, even the description that's used changes based on different characters. Like, Golkta will refer to what people are saying as "what insipid drivel" and things like that, whereas like Logan will be much more forgiving in his observations of others, because he's generally just trying to get along with life, you know. And then Jezal as well will just continuously insult people within the text. And it's so hard to describe until you read these books, but the prose oozes quality while also being simple. This isn't purple prose by any stretch of the imagination. It's not flowery language. It's very based on what character is speaking. And because of that, it just oozes character. Each chapter is a feast of characterization that is unlike anything else I've ever read, and I really cannot sit here and praise this book enough for that. And I'm getting distracted. It's supposed to be the introduction, so this book is very character driven. It follows a cast of primarily 3 characters, in total 6 characters, and there's not much of a plot here, but what is here is absolutely incredible. It's all set up. Pretty much everything in this book is set up for the next book, but goddamn, is this some of the best fucking setup I've ever read. Oh my god. Yeah. So I'm already getting away and getting distracted, but we'll go on to the things I like about the book next. So I'm going to make a couple points about the characterization in these books. I've spoken about the character's internal voice, and I'm going to talk about it a bit more here. Mainly I want to say the characters in this book are beautifully realised. They're vivid. They have so much life, and there's just something about these characters. When you read something that's really, really, really good, there's always that X factor, that thing that the author's doing that you just can't quite put your finger on. It's this ephemeral air of quality that you so rarely see, and this book brims with it. Every page is a joy to read. You know, I'll talk more about this in the prose part of the book, but what I mean by when I say they're realised is they have this incredibly well done inner voice that's recognisable and kind of gets you to know the mind of that character in every way, down to the language that's used, from every little action they take. There's something about reading Logan's kind of forlorn acceptance of the brutality of the world, and it's woven into every sentence, about Golkta's bubbling hatred, the bile that he thinks about others, and while at the same time experiencing his pain, because he is in so much pain all the time. And even Jezal, who is a who is a wonderful example of a character who is just a selfish cunt, and you slowly but surely come to sympathise with him because he's got this one thing going for him. The thing about Jezal is he's an arsehole in every single way. He has almost no redeeming qualities except for this one thing he's got going for him, and among the shit it gleams like a diamond, and it makes him a brilliant character. And this is one of those things where it's like you can't really point to one thing about the characterization, but all the characters are so realized, and they don't all have a lot of depth, but I think that's because real people don't either. There's a variety of characters here. Some of them feel like they have a lot of meat and depth to them and layers. Some of them just feel more simple than others, but that element of complexity, of realism, I've never read a book where the characters feel so real before, and to top all of that off, all the characters in this book are wonderfully morally ambiguous. There is no good guy in this book. I think Logan comes closest to being a good guy, but only because he's been a bad person in the past and he's trying to do better this time round. Not doing a very good job of it, but he's trying, and then he has this second personality in the back of his head that takes over and turns him into a monster. And you know, there's just I could go on about this all day, so I'm gonna stop. But what I'm trying to nail down here is that there's something about the writing of the characters in these books that is unlike anything else I've ever read. This is the first time I've read a book from the perspective of a character that commits domestic violence upon another character, and I was both horrified yet at the same time understood what the stresses that had led him to snap. Because throughout the book, he goes through this chapter where he basically goes through this like crucible of just shittiness that's just spewing at him all day, and one day, and then eventually he just snaps. It's his last nerve, and he does the unforgivable. And he's a piece of shit for it. But never have I felt so sympathetic for someone doing something so fucking terrible, and that is the beauty of the writing in these books. I am so attached to every character, and I am so down for seeing what happens to them, and they are all most of them horrible people who do not deserve better, but I still want to see them succeed. I still want to see them find happiness somehow. I don't know. It's probably never gonna happen in these fucking books because they are not happy books at all. They are not a good time for anyone involved. But yeah, I'll call this section "The Characters Are Vivid." I think that's the only way I can describe it, really. Vivid is the only word I can use to describe the characters in these books. They feel so close to real people. And it's every little bad thing that the characters do is framed in a way where you can either understand where they came from, why they did it, or they have a kind of a twist or a stint to their character that makes you kind of able to look past it and sympathise for them and root for them anyway. Golkta is the main example of this for me. He's been through so much shit. Part of me thinks, how can he be anything other than a monster? After everything that Golkta went through, how can he be anything but a monster? And the way that he's aware of it, and that he's constantly going through this existential dread of what it means to be alive. He speaks to himself. He walks through the book and he does horrible shit, and he'll say to himself, "Why do I do this? Why do I do this?" He'll be sat there cutting someone's fingers cutting them up with a hatchet, going, externally be like going crazy and frothing at the mouth to try and intimidate them, and internally he's completely calm. And he's thinking, why do I do this? Why do I get up every day? Why do I choose to do this? And there's something about all of the characters that is just so well done. And yeah, I mean, this guy takes the cake for character writing for me. This is some of the best character work I've ever seen. Probably the best. And I'm only on the first book. The first book of one trilogy, and then there's another trilogy following this. So we'll go on to the next point, because I could go on and on and on about this. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the fact that the characters in these books are all extremely flawed, and they are deeply morally grey characters. None of the characters could ever really be described as a good person, but at the same time they feel realistic, they feel grounded in the world that they're in, and at the same time many of them, you kind of end up reading their stories, and you kind of, at least especially for me with Golkta, kind of feel like they didn't really have much agency in ending up in the awful situations they're in, basically. I mean, for all the characters, you can go back and you can say they've made bad decisions throughout their lives that have led them to being where they are, and that's definitely true for all of the characters. Logan, for example, chose to be a warrior, and you know, he basically he lived the life of a warrior, and it didn't go that well for him because that's a bloody, dangerous life. Same with Golkta. Golkta joined the military and basically went to war and ended up in a situation where he was being tortured. Well, should he have been tortured? I suppose it's kind of irrelevant at that point. He was captured by his enemy in war, and war is war. Terrible things happen during war. But the reality of the situation is, they live in the world they're in. To sit down and point the finger at any of these characters, I feel, is kind of like the same mentality. To point the finger at them and say it's 100% their fault that they're in the situation they're in is kind of silly, because I feel like because of the nature of this world, most people would end up in those situations. I don't think it necessarily makes them a bad person. So, you know, they're definitely not good people. They're deeply flawed individuals, but they're individuals with depth where you can sympathise with them for being in their situations. So let's take like Golkta for example. Golkta was raised a nobleman, and he was fed his whole life, basically told that he had to be special, and he was special because he was an incredible fencer, and he ended up fighting in a war as a result. Surprise, surprise. And you know, the reality is, he ended up in the situation that most nobles would in his situation. Really, you know, he ended up going to war. When war breaks out in this kind of setting, everyone goes to war. It doesn't matter who you are, you end up going to war because the reality is you're required. You get conscripted probably, and then you end up fighting. And in Golkta's case, it goes very badly for him. And the things that he goes through are things that would break anyone, that would turn anyone into a shadow of their former self. And that's part of what makes him such a compelling character, is that he is such a vile, awful person. But at the same time, you can't help but sympathise with him. You can't help but feel like, would I be any different if I was in his situation? Probably not. You'd probably have to be pretty narcissistic to think that you wouldn't be a pretty fucked up individual after being tortured for 3 years straight. You know, that's the reality of the situation. Same with Logan, for example. Logan was young and naive, and part of a culture where killing and being a warrior was the norm. Sure, you can stand on your high modern day horse and say, killing's wrong, you shouldn't have done that, but that's not the reality of what it would be like to live in that world, and that's part of what makes these characters so sympathetic, yet deeply flawed. And, I mean, Logan's has an awful past, a very, very, very bloody past. Jezal doesn't have one yet, but Jezal is the exception to the rest of the characters in that Jezal's not had the awful shit happen to him yet. The other two have been through a lot of shit. Jezal's still early in his life, and I'm pretty sure, having read this book, he's gonna go through the shit during this book, whereas the others, it's just gonna be more shit piled on top of shit. So, yeah, what I'm trying to get at here is that the characters are morally grey and flawed, but you can see why and you can sympathise with them, and they are compelling despite that. That's all I have to say about that. The characters are each beautifully flawed and yet wonderfully sympathetic, if I had to put that into one sentence. You've seen a lot of death, then? Logan winced. In his youth, he would have loved to answer that very question. He would have bragged and boasted and listed the actions he'd been in, named men he'd killed. He couldn't say now, when the pride had dried up. It had happened, slowly, as the wars became bloodier, as the courses became excuses, as the friends went back to the mud, one by one. Logan rubbed at his ear, felt the big notch that Tolderu's sword had made, long ago. He could have stayed silent, but for some reason, he felt the need to be honest. I fought in 3 campaigns, he began, in 7 pitched battles, in countless raids and skirmishes and desperate defences and bloody actions of every kind. I've fought in the drifting snow, the blasting wind in the middle of the night. I've been fighting all my life, one enemy or another, one friend or another. I've known little else. I've seen men killed for a word, for a look, for nothing at all. A woman tried to stab me once for killing her husband, and I threw her down a well. And that's far from the worst of it. Life used to be cheap as dirt to me. Cheaper. I fought 10 single combats and won them all, but I fought on the wrong side, and for all the wrong reasons. I've been ruthless and brutal and a coward. I've stabbed men in the back, burned them, drowned them, crushed them with rocks, killed them when asleep, unarmed, or running away. I've run away myself more than once. I've pissed myself with fear. I've begged for my life. I've been wounded, often, and badly, and screamed and cried like a baby his mother took a tit away. I've no doubt the world would have been a better place if I'd been killed years ago, but I haven't been, and I don't know why. He looked down at his hands, pink and clean on the stone. There are few men with more blood in their hands than me. None, that I know of. The Bloody Nine, they call me, my enemies, and there's a lot of them. Always more enemies, and fewer friends. The blood gets you nothing but more blood. It follows me now, always, like my shadow. And like my shadow, I can never be free of it. I should never be free of it. I've earned it. I've deserved it. I've sought it out. Such is my punishment. So, Logen Ninefingers is the first viewpoint character of this book, and the very first page at the very first chapter, the end, begins from Logan's point of view. And it's an absolute fucking banger of a first chapter. It dives straight into the action, shows off one of Joe Abercrombie's greatest strengths, which is his writing of action, and really gets you into the head of Logan like straight away. It's just a brilliant first chapter. It's only 4 pages long, and it really just throws you straight in. And that's the chapter where I fell in love with Logen Ninefingers. Logan for me is the easiest character to like in this book. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that I am a fucking sucker for a redemption arc. Ultimately, Logan's story in this book is one of someone who's done a lot of really bad, terrible shit and has a dark past and is trying in vain and failing to escape from it and try and be just a little bit better than he was in the past. And honestly, his whole character arc in this book is extremely compelling. For me, besides Golkta, he is by far the strongest character in this book. There's something about him and his kind of forlorn acceptance of the way the world is, while also just continuously struggling against it in the most brutal fashion. Logan is a survivor first and foremost. No matter what you do to this guy, he will fucking find a way not to die. The first 100 pages or so of this book, all of Logan's viewpoint chapters from in that part of the book, is just him trying not to fucking die, basically. And it's just so compelling, and it's so well written. And there's something about Logan that's also just really tragic. He's this character who's only ever served powerful men, and he doesn't really know how to do anything but that. And he's kind of fallen back into the role of lapdog for Bayaz, who is the first of the Magi, who's basically this ancient wizard. And he falls back, without having the self-awareness to kind of know it, he's just kind of ended up with a new master. And I'm not convinced that Bayaz is that much better than Bethard was, who was his previous master. So previously, Logan served Bethard, who was basically a guy in the north, and in the north, in this world, is basically a country where there's loads of tribes and loads of villages, and they're just kind of disparate. There's no ruling kind of state or anything. They're just individual societies and individual villages, kind of like clans, basically. And Bethard went on a campaign to unite the north under one banner, not by choice. He is a despot of the highest caliber. He's basically forced the entirety of the North to serve him, and he basically rules through fear and lots of other typical evil methods. And he eventually betrayed Logan, cast him out, and Logan's family ended up dying, and now Logan is just kind of trying to survive. He's basically lost everything. He's lost his master, he's lost his place in the world, he's lost his family, and the only people he has left are his old crew, the Named Man, from when he was a warrior. And at the start of this book, they get ambushed, and he believes them all to have died. Now, they don't die. One of the other characters in the book, Dogman, is one of the members of his group, and his group do continue to go on and survive, and they're actually one of the main group's characters that we see from the viewpoint of throughout these books, and I will talk about them later. So Logan basically goes on and he tries to survive, and there's just something so compelling about him as a character. He has this kind of, like, you can tell he wants to do better and he doesn't want to be a killer anymore, but at the same time he's just continuously put in positions where he has to resort to it, and you can feel that how tired he is. He doesn't want to kill anymore. He doesn't want to fight. He just wants to live. He just wants to survive. He wants to find something new to do with his life, and he ends up basically following the path of least resistance, as most people would, and following Bayaz. And there's just something so compelling about him as a character. Not to mention that he is, as a character, just brimming with fucking charisma. He's both wise and stupid at the same time in a way that is really hard to pull off, and Joe Abercrombie pulls off so well here. And it's really interesting because when you read from Logan's perspective, he comes across as kind of this like wise old warrior, retired warrior kind of character. But then when he meets other characters later on, like Jezal, the way that they describe him is not at all how your mental image of him is from his internal monologue. He's kind of described as tall, brutish, ugly. His facial expression is kind of vacant, like he's not very intelligent, like he is stupid, and it kind of makes you start to think maybe he is actually kind of a bit dumb, because allowed himself to basically end up in the same situation he was in before by following Bayaz. And there's a lot of depth there, actually. I think I've seen people online say that Logan's a bit of a one-dimensional character. I don't agree that Logan's a one-dimensional character at all. I actually think, besides Golkta, he has the most depth of any character in these books, and comparing a character to Golkta for depth and characterization quality is a very big statement, because Golkta is a marvel of characterization, which we'll talk about in a bit. But there's something about all the different small components that come together to form one of the most vivid characters I've ever read from the perspective of. There's also just something about his brutality, where Logan doesn't see himself as dangerous, but he has become dangerous by habit. He's gotten to the point where he's so experienced in combat and so dangerous that he almost effortlessly just dispatches people, no matter how bad the situation is. He also has this kind of flagrant acceptance of the dangers of battle that is really interesting to read from. He'll be like talking about how he gets in a fight. There's this fight at the start where he ends up fighting 3 basically deserters. There's one with a bow, up in, maybe it's 4 actually. Anyway, either way, there's someone with a bow up in the trees to his left. There's 2 guys in front of him. I think there's 1 behind him. Yeah, I think there's 4. Okay, and basically he's like, right, a fight's gonna happen no matter what. They're either gonna take my food and we're gonna starve to death. So I have to fight them. I have no choice. So he goes to fight them. He fights them. He fucks the first 2 guys up. One of them spears it, basically gnashes him with the spear, and when he just goes up to this guy and he's beating the shit out of the first 2 guys and he's fighting them, in his head he's like, there's a spearman behind me and a guy that bow up there, they could kill me at any moment, nothing I can do about that, just keep fighting. And he'll just keep fighting, and then he would just like somehow scrape through. There's this kind of like acknowledgement in all of his fight scenes of how bad the situation really is all the time, just him just pushing through it. And there's something really compelling about that element of his character. And then at the end of the book, the last chapter of this book is from Logan's perspective. He ends up in a fight that spans the city, fighting a bunch of people in an alleyway, and then he ends up running through different parts of the city. He ends up in a coliseum. He's fighting them through a coliseum. He's climbing up the coliseum or fighting a bunch of people. Then he's like running and he jumps off the Colosseum when he's got nowhere to go, because he's on the edge of the Colosseum and he's surrounded by people, so he has nowhere to go. So he turns around and he just jumps off the edge to try and get to a building that's next to it. He slams down on top of it, is scrabbling to get up, he's trying to survive. His fingernails are coming off because he's scrabbling so hard, and he has this moment where he's like, I'm gonna die. I'm going to die. And then one of the other characters helps him get up, and he gets up, and then they're running through the city, and then they end up jumping when they're fighting people the whole way, they end up jumping from one building to a next, and they go through the ceiling because it's an old rickety building, and then they end up fighting a bunch of people in that building, and then they end up getting cornered in this room, and the Bloody Nine comes out. The way he describes his past actions is almost as if it's another person, and then it's confirmed at the end of the book that he basically has this second personality called the Bloody Nine that's like this raging homicidal maniac that just comes out. When it comes out, Logan's like reaction to it is just like, oh god, no, I thought I was done with you. And then he blacks out, and then we get this whole fight scene from the perspective of the Bloody Nine, and oh my god, this is one of the best fucking fight scenes I've ever read in my life. The entire last bit of this book feels like a scene from a Quentin Tarantino film. It's so cinematic, it's so perfectly written, it's so well paced, and it doesn't stop. The action doesn't fucking stop, and it hits so fucking hard. It's incredible, and they just completely sold me on Logan as a character. I thought that the whole thing with him having this second personality is absolutely brilliant. Basically, Logan is fighting, and he's gotten to the point where he's basically on the brink of death, and he kind of accepts his life. He says, all things come to an end. There was a cold feeling in Logan's stomach, a feeling he hadn't felt for a long time. No, he whispered, I'm free of you, but it was too late, dot dot dot. And he goes to the next line, and there was blood on him, but that was good. And it completely changes like another character entirely. There was always blood, but he was kneeling, and that was wrong. The Bloody Nine kneels to no man. His fingers saw out the cracks between the stones in the fireplace, prizing between them like old tree roots pulling him up. His leg hurt and he smiled. The pain was fuel that made the fires burn. Something moved in front of him. Masked men, enemies. Corpses then. You're hurt, Northman. Eyes of the closest one sparked above his mask, the shining blade of his axe danced in the air. You want to give up yet? Hurt? The Bloody Nine threw back his head and laughed. I'll fucking show you hurt. He tumbled forward, flowed beneath the axe, slippery as fishes in the river, swinging the heavy blade in a great low circle. It crunched into the man's knee and cracked it back the wrong way, scythed up into his upper leg, ripped it out from underneath him. He gave a muffled scream as he fell onto the stones, turning around and round in the air, Shatter's legs flopping. Something dug into the Bloody Nine's back, but there was no pain. It was a sign, a message in a secret tongue, that only he could understand. It told him where the next dead man was standing. There's just something about the way Joe Abercrombie writes characters from their internal monologue that is absolutely fucking incredible. And yeah, so that's me finished. That's 15 minutes of me gushing about Logen Ninefingers the character. I don't know where we're gonna go with Logan as a character. I cannot wait to see what happens. Yeah, that's just one character, and I want to talk about most of the characters. So Logan was an absolute joy to read from the perspective of. He is a brilliant character, and I loved every second of his chapters for so many reasons. So I'm going to move on now. Why do I do this? Inquisitor Golkta asked himself for the 1000th time as he limped down the corridor. The walls were rendered and whitewashed, though none too recently. There was a seedy feel to the place and a smell of damp. There were no windows, as the hallway was deep within the ground, and the lanterns cast slow, flowing shadows into every corner. Why would anyone want to do this? Golkta's walking made a steady rhythm on the grinding tiles of the floor. First, the confident click of his right heel, then the tap of his cane, then the endless sliding of his left foot, with the familiar stabbing pains in the ankle, knee, arse and back. Click, tap, pain. That was the rhythm of his walking. The dirty monotony of the corridor was broken from time to time by a heavy door, bound and studded with pitted iron. On one occasion, Golkta thought he heard a muffled cry of pain from behind one. I wonder what poor fool is being questioned in there, what crime they are guilty or innocent of, what secrets are being picked at, what lies cut through, what treasons laid bare. He didn't wander long, though. He was interrupted by the steps. If Golkta had been given the opportunity to torture any one man, anyone at all, he would surely have chosen the inventor of steps. When he was young and widely admired before his misfortunes, he'd never really noticed them. He'd sprung down them 2 at a time and gone blithely on his way. No more. They're everywhere. You really can't change floors without them. And down is worse than up. That's the thing people never realise. Going up, you usually don't fall that far. He knew this flight well. 16 steps cut from smooth stone, a little worn towards the centre, slightly damp, like everything down here. There was no banister, nothing to cling to. 16 enemies. A challenge indeed. It had taken Golkta a long time to develop the least painful method of descending stairs. He went sideways, like a crab. Cane first, then left foot, then right, with more the usual agony as his left foot took his weight, joined by a persistent stabbing in the neck. Why should it hurt in my neck when I go downstairs? Does my neck take my weight? Does it? Yet the pain could not be denied. Golkta paused, 4 steps from the bottom. He had nearly beaten them. His hand was trembling on the handle of his cane, his left leg aching like fury. He tongued his gums where his front teeth used to be, took a deep breath and stepped forward. His ankle gave way with a horrifying retch, and he plunged into the space, twisting, lurching, his mind like a cauldron of horror and despair. He stumbled onto the last step like a drunkard, fingernails scratching at the smooth wall, giving a squeal of terror. "You stupid, stupid, stupid bastard!" His cane clattered to the floor, his clumsy feet wrestled with the stone, and he found himself at the bottom, by some miracle, still standing. And here it is, that horrible, beautiful, stretched out moment between stubbing your toe and feeling the hurt. How long do I have before the pain comes? How bad will it be when it does? Gasping, slack-jawed at the foot of the steps, Golkta felt a tingling of anticipation. Here it comes. The agony was unspeakable. A searing spasm up his left side from foot to jaw. He squeezed his watering eyes tight shut, clamped his right hand over his mouth so hard that the knuckles clicked. His remaining teeth grated against each other as he locked his jaws together, but a high-pitched, jagged moan still whistled from him. Am I screaming or laughing? How do I tell the difference? He breathed in heaving gasps through his nose, snot bubbling out onto his hand, his twisted body shaking with the effort of staying upright. The spasm passed. Golkta moved his limbs cautiously, one by one, testing the damage. His leg was on fire, his foot numb, his neck clicked with every movement, sending vicious little stings down his spine. Pretty good, considering. He bent down with an effort and Pitt snatched up his cane between 2 fingers, drew himself up once more, wiped the snot and tears on the back of his hand. Truly a thrill. Did I enjoy it? For most people, stairs are a mundane affair. For me, an adventure. So, next, I want to talk about Golkta. So Golkta is, I think most people would agree, by far the most compelling character in this book. His story is very interesting, it's very engaging, and the most important thing about Golkta as a character is that he is just a fascinating example of a awful human being written right and written in a way that makes him so sympathetic, because Golkta basically... So Golkta was a nobleman who was a master fencer. So in the world of the First Law books, there is a fencing tournament that happens every now and then, every year I think it is, and if you win and you become the champion in this fencing tournament, you basically, no matter who you are, whether you're a commoner, a noble, whatever, you're basically guaranteed a place in society. Okay, so you won't ever starve. You'll always be successful in the military or whatever. It's basically a status symbol that's never going to go away. Golkta won that tournament, and then he's been mentioned many times to be the best fencer of all time, basically. At least he was, until during a recent war, he ended up being captured and tortured for 3 years, and his body is broken. His body barely works. He can barely make it up and down stairs. He has like no teeth. So basically his teeth are removed. If he has a tooth on the top jaw, the corresponding tooth on the bottom jaw has been removed. So he can't actually chew anything because his teeth are basically alternated, having all been removed. So although he has teeth, he can't chew anything because it would just be tooth against gum. All of his joints are fucked. He needs a walking stick to walk. Basically, his fencing days are way behind him. Not to mention that his whole body is just grotesque to look at, and he's generally extremely fucked up. He is not who he once was. He was once a handsome man who all of the women wanted to sleep with, all of the men looked up to. He was basically living the life, and it was all taken from him in the most horrifying way possible. And now he is a jaded man full of basically hatred, and there's something about the way Golkta's written that is just so fucking compelling, because he joins the Inquisition. Okay, so he's an inquisitor, and his job is basically to torture confessions out of people, whether they were in the right or the wrong. Okay, at the beginning of this book, he ends up basically with someone, and he's torturing them to try and get a confession out of them, and they are probably innocent of what they're being tortured to confess for. Sult, Archlector Sult, who's basically the head of the Inquisition, turns up and tells him that he wants a confession out of this guy. So Golkta gets the confession out of him the hard way, and then goes on to basically start working for Archlector Sult. Now, Archlector Sult is a man who has his own political views and beliefs, and is corrupt to the extreme, and has no interest in justice at all. He's using his political position to torture confessions out of people, to ruin them. And what's basically going on at the moment is, in the Society of the First Law, there is a rising of kind of this rich commoner class, the merchant class. Basically, old school nobles don't like them because they don't agree that commoners should be living in luxury and should be living the lives that they are, and they don't believe that commoners should have a say in how the country is ran and how things go. So the merchant class are basically, through money, becoming extremely powerful, right? They can bribe, they can persuade, they can do all sorts of things that commoners had never been able to do before, and Archlector Sult does not like that at all. He does not think that's how the world should be. So he basically is using his power and his position and Golkta as his pawn to basically torture the fuck out of a bunch of people to get them to admit that they've been committing a bunch of fraud, which they haven't been committing, supposedly, although maybe they have, it's not really clear. Basically fabricate a conspiracy to further the political goals of Archlector Sult. And later on, this also brings Archlector Sult into odds with Bayaz, and that's kind of how Golkta ends up involved with Bayaz and the rest of the cast. What I'm trying to get at here, the plot that's going on with Golkta is very compelling and very interesting. At least I thought it was. And Golkta as a character is just phenomenal. I've never read from the perspective of a character like Golkta before. It's so hard to pin down what makes Golkta a great character. He has so many facets and so many elements of his character. There's this kind of twisted, haunting element of his personality where he's doing all these awful things and he still kind of just doesn't even know why. It's like feels like it's the only thing he can do, like it's the only way he can be useful. He has this scene later on with Major West that is really, really, really heartfelt and really kind of peels back that jaded, scarred exterior of his character, and you kind of see that there's a little bit of a heart there still beating inside of his chest, but barely. It's like a glimmer of his humanity remains. It's just absolutely phenomenal character writing. I don't really want to keep talking about this because, quite frankly, if I allow myself to, I will talk about Golkta for an hour straight. As a character, he has this brilliant internal voice as well. The way that Golkta's chapters are written is he has a lot of internal monologuing, so he'll speak to himself in his head. And one of the things that's so compelling about him as a character is that he will be acting one way externally and saying something completely different in his head. So like he'll be talking to Jezal and he'll be like, "Oh yes, Jezal, nice to meet you, and stuff like that, and being like really nice, and then the inside he's like, "Nice to meet you, arrogant swine," and he's just like completely different on the inside to how he presents himself. And Golkta kind of has this element of his personality where he likes to creep people out, he likes to kind of revel in their disgust at his very existence, because people they don't even want to be in the same room as him, they don't even want to look at him, and Golkta just kind of forces them to, and he derives some small twisted pleasure from that. One of the few things that he can enjoy in life anymore, considering his body is continuously racked by unimaginable pain. Golkta, it's kind of hard to explain what makes Golkta so compelling, because there's so many things, but also they're all very subtle. For me, Golkta's just one of the best fictional characters ever. Every time there's a Golkta chapter, I get giddy. I'm like, oh, what the fuck is Golkta doing now, man? Like, what awful heinous shit is Golkta up to? Golkta is a fucking phenomenal character, and I really can't wait to see where his story goes, because at the end of this book, he kind of just gets sent off somewhere else, because he ends up kind of pissing off Archlector Salt and Loki letting him down as fuck. So another thing, one of the things about Golkta is like he's getting involved in this extremely dangerous political game that could get him killed at any point, and he just kind of throws himself headfirst into it, because what else would he do? You know, like what else does he have to live for? But then he has certain characters that he has a soft spot for and he actually cares about. It's goddamn what a character. Joe Abercrombie really knocked this out of the park. It's so rare to read a book and have a character like Golkta be a character and actually work. Usually when you get a character who is just a piece of shit, it's really hard to empathise and sympathise with them, but there's just so many elements of Golkta's character and his past that just make him so compelling and sympathetic. He's tragic. He's a truly tragic character, but at the same time, you kind of love to hate him. You kind of feel like he deserves to be in the situation he's in, while also rooting for him. It's a really unique experience to read from Golkta's perspective. Just Golkta is just wow. Goddamn, what a character. Joe Abercrombie has knocked it out of the park with the characterization of Golkta, doing something I've never seen done successfully before, and to such a high quality of characterization that it really is that X factor. You know, when you read something that's really high quality and it's so hard to put your finger on the specific thing, to pinpoint that one thing that makes it so high quality, that's basically the essence of Golkta. He is the definition of a character that, on paper, when you write out all the elements of his character and all the things about him, you're like, goddamn, what an irredeemable piece of garbage. But when you actually read from his perspective, it's like, fucking hell, this just works. It just works. To quote the Todd Howard, the man himself, it just works. Jezal scraped the last fair hairs from the side of his jaw and washed the razor off in the bowl. Then he wiped it on the cloth, closed it, and placed it carefully on the table, admiring the way the sunlight glinted on the mother-of-pearl handle. He wiped his face and then, his favourite part of the day, gazed at himself in the looking glass. It was a good one, newly imported from Visserine, a present from his father, an oval of bright, smooth glass and a frame of lavishly carved dark wood, a fitting surround for such a handsome man as the one gazing happily back at him. Honestly, handsome hardly did him justice. "You're quite the beauty, aren't you?" Jezal said to himself, smiling as he ran his fingers over the smooth skin of his jaw. And what a jaw it was! He had often been told it was his best feature, Not that there was anything whatever wrong with the rest of him. He turned to the right, then to the left, the better to admire that magnificent chin. Not too heavy, not brutish, not too light either, not womanly or weak. A man's jaw, no doubt, with a slight cleft in the chin, speaking of strength and authority, but sensitive and thoughtful too. Had there ever been a jaw like it? Perhaps some king or hero of legend once had one almost as fine. It was a noble jaw, that much was clear. No commoner could ever have a chin so grand. It must have come from his father's side of the family, Jezal supposed. His father had a rather weak chin, his brothers too, come to think of it. He had to feel a little sorry for them. He had got all the looks in the family. And most of the talent too, he murmured happily to himself. He turned away from the mirror with some reluctance, striding into his living room, pulling his shirt on and buttoning it up to the front. He had to look his best today. The thought gave him a little shiver of nerves, starting in his stomach, creeping up his windpipe, lodging in his throat. By now the gates would be open. A steady flow of people would be filling into the Agriont, taking their seats on the great wooden benches of the Square of Marshals. Thousands of them. Everyone who was anyone, and plenty more who weren't. They were already gathering, shouting, jostling, excited, waiting for him. Jezal coughed and tried to push the thought from his mind. He had kept himself awake with it for half the night already. He moved over to the table where the breakfast tray was sitting. He picked up a sausage absently in his fingertips and took a bite off the end, chewing it without relish. He wrinkled his nose and tossed back in the dish. He had no appetite this morning. So, next I want to talk about Jezal. Jezal Dan Luthar, who is, as the blurb describes, paragon of selfishness. Yeah, that's pretty accurate, to be fair. So, Jezal is another example of a kind of character that gets done a lot, but so rarely gets done well. And I think that's one of the things that's really so impressive about Joe Abercrombie's kind of character writing in general, is that he manages to take characters that have no right to be lovable or likable, and yet he makes them that way anyway. At the very least, he makes them so that we can love to hate them. And for me, Jezal is a brilliant example, again, of a writing technique within characters that I really like, and that is taking a character and starting them as unlikable and developing them into a character that's likable, because seeing that journey of going from hating a character to loving them is a brilliant way to have the reader be attached to that character, because they've gone through a journey with them. Jezal is that. He is that in essence. So Jezal is pretty much the definition of a self-entitled, vain, selfish prick. He is pretty much a person with no redeeming qualities, apart from he has some a bit of talent for fencing. At the beginning of this book, Jezal is training to take part in the contest, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a fencing contest where basically a bunch of people fence, and the winner will basically have glory for the rest of their lives and will basically have a leg up in life, pretty much. Most of the important people, well, not most, but many of the important people in the society which these characters live in have begun their journey through society and began their rise to power having won this contest. So it's a big deal. And the thing about Jezal is he's a selfish prick who's never worked hard a day in his fucking life. And he goes through this character arc in this book of basically having to suck it up and learning to actually fucking do something with his life and actually try. And it's quite a compelling character arc, and it makes Jezal, despite all of his flaws, very compelling as a character. And we kind of see him go from drunkard to successful in one book. We also see him go through some character development specifically regarding some ongoing romantic affairs. Specifically with a woman called R.D. West. Now, R.D. West is a commoner. She is Major West's younger sister. The brewing war with the North led Major West to bring R.D. to the Agriant, which is basically the centre of the Union, which is the society that the main characters live in, to keep her closer to him and basically to the heart of the country, so that if war does break out, she'll be safe. Now, she hates it here. She absolutely hates it. In the Agriant, she has no friends. She can't really get along with anyone because it's where all the nobles live, and she's a commoner, and nobody really wants anything to do with her. So, and Major West just kind of ignores her because he's too busy. Jezal's the only guy who pays any attention to her, really, and Jezal becomes infatuated with her. Now, the thing about Jezal is he's very obsessed with appearances. He's very superficial. He wants to marry a woman who has a lot of money and is beautiful. At the start of the book, he meets a couple of noble women who have a lot of money and are very mousy, very kind of generic medieval noblewoman. They're basically taught to be very meek, very kind of basically sit there and let men speak at them, and basically have their personalities crushed by the patriarchal society that they live in. Jezal meets RD, who doesn't have any of the physical traits that nobles typically find attractive, and she's got a bit of a mouth on her, she talks back, she's a bit feisty, and to all intents and purposes, from his own understanding of society and his entire life so far, there's no reason Jezal should find her attractive. Yet he falls in love with her anyway because it's the real deal, basically. And he undergoes he has a bit of a conflict within himself of being scared of how it would look if he was to court a commoner. And eventually he kind of gets over it, except when he does finally get over it, events transpire and pull him away from RD before they can really do anything about the fact that he likes her. It's not really clear whether she really likes him that much. I found that to be a very compelling character arc. It's really fun as well to read from the perspective of Jezal, when normally he's so witty and he's very good at etiquette and acting basically the way he should, while also being able to subtly insult people and be an asshole to people basically in public and get away with it. Whereas when he talks to RD, he's the complete opposite. It's like his brains melt away and he's just and he stutters a lot. It's kind of adorable in a weird way, despite the fact that he's an asshole. And I've really found Jezal, I really grew to like Jezal. I didn't like him to start off with, and that's why the quote that I chose for him was later on in the book, because to start, although I liked reading his chapters, it was mostly a case of being entertained at just how comically stereotypical he was. How he was he's basically everything you imagine about the bad parts of being a nobleman. Everything you can think of rolled into one, and he has these small few redeeming qualities. When he puts his mind to it, he's able to achieve a goal, and also he's probably one of the only nobles in the entirety of the Agriant who was actually willing to be with a commoner, which, says a bit, to be fair. It says that maybe his shittiness is learned, and it can be unlearned. Maybe. So, there's hope for Jezal, and I found him although he's my least favourite character of the three main characters, I would still put him in S tier for character writing, because he is an example of how to do a character that is so fucking hard to do well, and Joe Abercrombie absolutely nails it. Another thing is he has loads of really good character moments, I thought, and also some of his interactions with Golkta I thought were absolutely brilliant. One of my favourite things about this book in general is seeing how characters see themselves and seeing how the other characters see them from their chapters. Because when Golkta, Logan, and Jezal are in the same room, which doesn't happen until the last third of the book, but when they are, it gives you a completely new perspective on these characters. And Jezal's interactions with Golkta are probably the most interesting of any of the two characters interacting with one another. Golkta and Jezal is great. Golkta cannot stand Jezal, and Jezal just finds Golkta to be disgusting, basically. Just can't stand to be in the same room as him. But yeah, less to say about Jezal, because there's just kind of less to say about him. I could go on about his story, but there's not really any point going on about it, because it's not really what makes Jezal's chapters good. His story, his personal story, is very simple. He is training to take part in the contest. He eventually takes part in the contest. He almost wins. And then he gets to the end and he fights a guy who's basically way better than him, essentially. And Bayaz is watching, and Bayaz wants to use him for his own ends. So Bayaz uses a bit of magic to give Jezal a bit of a boost, and Jezal wins the fight. Jezal does not win the contest legitimately. He wins the contest by Bayaz. That's all I really want to say about Jezal. Less to say about, like I said, less to say about him than the others. But I don't want to understate Jezal as a character, because I really do think Jezal's a brilliantly done character, and although he was my least favourite of the three, he was still a great character, and I really, really enjoyed reading his chapters, even though Golkta's were probably my favourite. Jezal's were probably up there, basically on par with Logan, I would say, generally his chapters were. So that is all three of the main viewpoint characters, and I just want to finish by this little section by saying all three of the main viewpoint characters in this book, I keep saying these books, I've only read the first one, in this book, are, in my opinion, incredible examples of characterization. The characters in these books, this is like God tier, this is like above S tier, okay? The characterization in these books, it is brilliant. I cannot wait to read the next one. So, Column West, or Major West, is one of the other viewpoint characters in this book, and I want to talk about him a bit, because I thought it was a really cool character. A lot of the world building is done through his perspective. Most of the world building is between him and Jezal, but the thing that I really liked about his chapters were the fact that a lot of what was going on with the brewing war with the North was basically completely presented to us through West. Since Jezal basically didn't give a fuck about it, and also isn't important enough in the army to really know what's going on. The other thing I really liked about Major West was a lot of the kind of cultural world building to do with the relationships between the different classes, so the nobles and the commoners, was mostly presented through the way that he was treated by other characters. So a lot of the other characters who West would speak to, who are nobles in the army, were kind of condescending to him and clearly didn't really want him in the army. Even Jezal himself thought probably Major West shouldn't even be in the army because he's a commoner. On top of that, you also get the fact that West is continuously struggling with this discrimination, essentially, and that obsession with how he's viewed as a result of him constantly being under that pressure is one of the things that leads to him going on to snap and basically abuse his sister. And also just, I thought West as a character was really fucking interesting. His viewpoint chapters are actually some of my favourite throughout the book, and it was cool because one of my favourite things about his chapters and about his story in this book is that he's kind of presented as like the only good person, really, in the series, or at least in the first book. And then out of nowhere he just beats the shit out of his sister, just abuses the fuck out of her, and then she turns around and just tells him that he's no better now than their abusive father. It just fucking comes out of nowhere. It came out of nowhere, slaps you around the face with a bit of domestic violence, and reminds you so hard, pulls you down to earth, that none of the characters in this book are good people. Major West is probably the closest one to being a good person, to being virtuous. It's even he has this fatal flaw of being unable to control his anger and his emotions. When he was put under all the stress as a result of the preparations for the war, he just snaps and he just beats the shit out of his sister. His chapters were really, really interesting, I thought. It was interesting how they tied into all the other characters. His scene with Golkta later on was one of my favourite scenes in the whole book. After basically beating the shit out of RD doesn't want anything to do with them anymore, understandably. So, racked with guilt, Major West goes to go see Golkta, but the intention of asking Golkta to look after RD when he's away at war and they kind of bond over their hatred of themselves a little bit, and it's quite a heartfelt scene for Golkta, really, because it's the first time you ever see any fucking humanity in the man. Overall, I just thought it was a great side character. Like all the characters in these books, I thought he was great. The other main side viewpoint character is the Dogman. Now, the Dogman is a old follower of Logen. Now, right at the beginning of the book, in the very first chapter, called The End, the Dogman is separated from Logen during a scuff with some creatures known as Shankar. Basically, they end up fighting these Shankar and they get separated. Logen ends up getting flung off a cliff, barely survives, then manages to basically slowly work his way back up to where the campsite was to see and check for survivors. He manages to get some supplies, but he's unable to find any of the others, so he assumes that they're dead. Then, sometime later, we get a chapter from the Dogman's perspective, where him and all of the other members of Logan's old crew are able to basically rendezvous and basically start deciding what they're going to do without Logan, because they think Logan's dead like he thinks they're dead. And the Dogman, like all the other characters, has a inner voice that's very distinct, and I actually really liked him as a character. I thought it was really interesting. He's kind of like the straight man of Logan's old crew, and it's really interesting to see Logan's old crew and the people he used to hang out with, because it really helps contextualize Logan's character. So the old crew that Logan has were all a bunch of named men, so they were basically famous warriors from the north, and Logan was able to kind of reel them all in, either by force of will, pure leadership ability, or fighting, as you can expect. Some of the members of his crew, like Black Dow, are basically fucking insane and are barely fucking people, like are terrible people, degenerates of the highest caliber. But the Dogman's alright. Hard and Grim, Black Dow, Folly the weakest, and Road 3 Trees. Now, basically, after getting separated from the rest of the group, from Logan, the crew basically decide, fuck this, we're going back to the north again. So they turn around and they go back. Go and they try and essentially, so they return to Carlion, which is basically where Bethard lives. It's basically his capital. And they send in Folly the Weakest to try and warn Bethard of the Shankar that are coming, since basically most of the northern warriors will be gone fighting in the war with the south. They wanted to warn someone. So they go back and they go to warn them. They send Foley in, and Foley doesn't come back. Foley doesn't make it. This was actually kind of a hard-hitting scene for me. I actually was really surprised when he died, and although he was kind of not really a major side character, there was something about Foley as a character in the background. The thing about Logan's crew in general is they all have so much personality, but they only get like 3 or 4 chapters, I think, throughout the whole book. And J.R. Abercrombie does a really good job of characterizing all these side characters to the point where they're at least interesting to read about. And you kind of get to know them all a little bit, and when Foley dies, it's kind of a shame. I remember feeling kind of crestfallen about that, because it was just kind of sad to see them go through everything they went through and then go and try and do the right thing, and their reward is just to get fucking killed, basically. So they end up fighting each other, they end up fighting their way back out. Foley's dead now, and they decide, fuck this, we're going to go to the south, and we're going to join them, we're going to help them fight the north. So overall, this kind of side story was really fucking good, I thought. This is one of the highlights of the book, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the chapters from Dogman's perspective. I really like Dogman. I think Dogman's a cool character. He gives some really interesting world building through his views and the things that he says kind of passively in the text. So overall, another great side character. And the rest of Logan's crew as well. Great cast of characters. So the last side character that I want to talk about, viewpoint character, that I want to talk about, is Ferro Maljinn. Now, Ferro Maljinn is a Gurkish individual who comes from the Empire, and she is heavily implied to have had a very traumatic past regarding being previously being a slave. And she's a recently escaped slave, and of all the characters in the books, so far, she is by far the most damaged, and the character who has the least regard for human life. so far. She is basically fucking feral, and she's a goddamn survivor. She's really interesting because she comes from a completely different continent to all the other characters, and there's lots of world building to do with that part of the world that is done through her perspective. She also meets some really interesting characters, and she eventually ends up in the Agrian again with the heart of the Union, and she runs into the rest of the characters to ends up joining Bayaz's crew at the end of the book. She's got some interesting stuff going on. It's it's heavily implied that she has some kind of healing factor or something, because she keeps getting really fucked up and she just won't fucking die. She also seems to have some kind of like low level magical powers going on, and I don't know what she is. It's kind of implied she has something to do with demons, and it might have something to do with eaters, which are basically these things, these people that exist in the Gurkish Empire that also have unusual powers. Overall, I thought her story in this book, the first chapter from her perspective didn't grip me, I'll be honest with you, but all the other chapters from her perspective did. And I thought they were quite interesting. I don't think she's likable. She's not like the other characters. I don't think she's really likable. She's just kind of feral, kind of treats everyone like shit, doesn't want to be controlled, which makes perfect sense because she used to be a slave. But I think overall she's definitely the weakest character, in the weakest viewpoint character in the whole book. That being said, she has some really interesting stuff going on, and I'm very interested to see how that progresses into the future books. So I don't really have much to say about her besides that. She has some really cool scenes. Some of the world building about the other parts of the world are really interesting from her perspective. It was cool to see some places in the world other than basically mostly the same places from the other characters' perspectives. So yeah, that's Ferro Maljinn. Like the others, I thought she was a fine side character, the weakest, but nonetheless has some really interesting stuff going on. Even the worst of the characters in this book I thought were pretty good, really. So that should basically tell you everything you need to know about the quality of the characterization in these books. Last but not least, I want to talk about a very important character, and that is Bayaz the Magi. Bayaz the Magi is pretty much the one character who's driving the plot in this book, besides Bethard, I suppose. And Bayaz basically rounds up all the characters because he has a need of them. The thing about Bayaz is he has that major shaker, major mover kind of vibe going on, and he clearly has a plan. He clearly has an intention. He's using the characters in this book for something. He has unrevealed villain vibes, but he's also a really fucking cool character. So he's able to use magic as Magi. Now, I'll talk about the magic in a bit, but he does not shy away from showing his power when necessary. Throughout the book, he does a couple of things. Most noticeably, he just immolates a shit ton of people at one point in the book when they're surrounded. Him and Logan are surrounded. Also, he turns one of the Inquisitors just into red fucking mist. Kind of badass. He has a lot of really good scenes, and he's just a very well written character. You can really feel that Bayaz is an ancient, powerful, and intelligent being, and that's really well presented through his basically extremely brutal and efficient competency. He basically gets shit done, and he knows when to use others to get shit done. He's a bit of a badass, and he has one of the best scenes introducing a character that I've ever read in a book. So when Logan finally arrives to come meet the first of the Magi, comes in, and he walks on up to this castle, or this manor or whatever, and there's this old guy stood in the doorway, and he's got a long beard, and he looks very wizardly, he's wearing a robe. And then on the right, this big muscular bald guy, who is basically slaughtering a goat with a knife. And it's just kind of mentioned in passing in the background, but Logan walks up to this guy, and he's like, I'm here first of the Magi, and then the guy at the front is like, oh yeah, actually, I'm not the first of the Magi, my bad. And then the guy who's just slaughtering this goat with a knife, and his arms are covered in blood, walks on over, washes his hands, and is like, I'm the first of the Magi. And it's this fucking short, bald dude who's ripped, and you're like, what the fuck? It was a really fucking cool introduction to Bayaz as a character. He's clearly got a lot going on, he's clearly got some seriously fucking ancient beef. And he also really is not a fan of Bethard. He clearly helped Bethard at some point achieve the level of power that he has, and he seems to regret that decision. Perhaps seeks to undo it. Bayaz is one of the greatest joys of this book, and he has some absolutely fucking incredible quotes. He has this scene where he's talking to Logan about a sword as a weapon and how a sword has a voice. It's just a really cool scene. Generally, I don't want to sit here and talk about Bayaz for too long, but Bayaz is one of the strongest characters in this book. Like all the characters in this book, he's very, very well written, and he's just fucking cool as hell. He kind of makes me think of more scary, more hench, more badass Gandalf. He's certainly less personable than Gandalf, and he's got a bit of a anger management problem from what I can tell. He really does not like to be fucked around with, and he has a lot of pride. He does not like to be disrespected. He expects to be treated with respect as the first of the Magi, regardless of whether or not the people believe that he is or is not the first of the Magi. And there's some really, really interesting scenes with them to do with the world building. The scene when they go into the House of the Maker is one of my favourite scenes in any book. I thought it was fucking awesome and really fucking cool. And it's very mysterious. This whole like backstory lore element of the world in this book really gripped me. I'll talk about the world building in a bit, but Bayaz is central to that, so Bayaz has just some of the coolest fucking scenes. The scene when Bayaz just melts a dude is cool as fuck. The scene where he turns the Inquisitor into red mist. Yeah, Bayaz is fucking sick. I do think that Bayaz will end up being the main villain, I have to say. He has major unrevealed villain vibes. And some of the stuff he says at the end of the book, yeah, it kind of has some implications to do with maybe Bayaz changing his mind about some of the rules of magic and maybe deciding that he's going to break them. Overall, a fucking awesome character. Right, so next I want to talk about the world building and the setting, because I've not really talked about that much in this, and I don't really want to understate it, because the way Joe Abercrombie does world building is really interesting to me. It's a lot of show and not a lot of tell. There is a bit of tell, but it's mostly show. And the world that the characters inhabit is primarily, most of the story happens in the Union. Now, the Union is basically the biggest power on the map, essentially, and most of the main characters live in Adua, which is the capital city of the Union, and also, to go even deeper, they live in the Agriant, which is basically the centre of Adua, which is where the royal palace is, basically. The world and the society is extremely corrupt, and it's basically a joke of a monarchy. The king is a fat, old, barely capable degenerate of the highest caliber. His son is a fool, and there's pretty much no real hope for the Union. The Union is basically on the brink of collapse. Because it has no unified idea, no unified cause, everyone's fighting each other. Like I mentioned earlier, to do with Architect Jezal, he has his own political views and he's willing to basically rip the Union apart for his own political goals. And all of the other people in the Union are no different. And on top of that, they just can't fucking work together at all. The nobles hate the commoners hate the nobles, the merchant class just care about making a shit ton of money and don't care about the state of the country at all to achieve it. All the different parts of the Union just only care about themselves. It's basically your average British person's view of how government works, to be honest with you. You see this quite a lot in general fiction written by British authors. I mean, you see it in Warhammer 40k most famously, which obviously the government in Warhammer 40k, the Imperium, is a administration monster which is impossible to maintain and is a direct criticism of the government. And it feels the same way in this in this book as well. It's just a mess, and you really get the sense very early in to the first book that the Union is not ready for war. It seems that it certainly is not, at least by the end of the first book. Something is going to have to seriously change in the next book for the Union to have a chance against the North, I think. Not only that, but considering that the Gurkish are considering invading again from the south, things ain't looking so good for the Union. I found the world to be really interesting. I liked how corrupt it was. I liked how fat and lazy the society had grown on peace. In general, I just thought that the world building that was here was really of really high quality. It really felt like there was a lot of detail paid to all the little small things that really matter. You know, you really get a sense for what people were doing in the world during their spare time, what it was like to live there, things like that I think a lot of the time are missed. I think a lot of the time authors are very good at presenting what it's like for their characters to live in that world, but not what it's like for the average person to live in that world. And in general, I just found the world building to be really good. I also find the setting really interesting. There are also some other little world building tidbits that I found really interesting. The first one was the general kind of backstory of the world, to do with Bayaz, I think is how you say it, and his children, basically supplanting magic into the world. I found the fact that Shankar weren't human to be interesting. At the start of the book, Logan is fighting some Shankar, and they're kind of described as looking fucked up, kind of savage or whatever, and having elongated faces and stuff. But I still thought they were basically just humans. There was no kind of real implication that they weren't human, just because they weren't speaking a language that could be understood. I thought they were just like a tribal culture of some description. But it turns out no, they're just like a straight up creature that was created. I thought that was pretty cool. Some of the world building stuff as well later on to do with the other countries I thought was really interesting. I can't wait to find out more about some of the things I mentioned. The Old Empire I think gets mentioned, and I believe some of the characters are going there, and I can't wait to see what that's like because apparently it's chaos. That'll be really cool. Yeah, overall, even though the world building definitely takes a backseat in these books, it's not kind of encyclopedic world building. It's world building that is relevant to the story and the characters, and I really respect that, to be fair. I think that there's something to be said about the fact that there's not any real point in basically just shoving history lessons down the reader's throat. The only real world building that's necessary to tell a good fantasy story is world building that is relevant to the characters and what's going on in the story. And I think that if that is basically the baseline for good world building, J.R. Abercrombie absolutely nails it. So, having only read the first book, I was impressed with the world building. I liked it. I really liked the setting. I think it's really cool, and I cannot wait to see the expansion of the world building. I can't wait to see some more details about the world in general in the next book. Last thing I want to talk about to do with the world building is the magic. And I suppose you can't really talk about a fantasy series that has magic in it without talking about the magic. So, the magic in this book is extremely soft. That being said, I think it works really well. I'm definitely not one of those people who thinks that hard magic or the highway. I love Brandon Sanderson's books, the ones that I've read anyway, and I think that his hard magic systems are brilliant. That being said, I don't think magic has to be completely explained to be good. I just think that magic to be good, in my opinion, is to not make it like Harry Potter. And what I mean by that is, for me, the biggest problem I have with magic and fantasy sometimes is that it's just not explained enough. It's not that it needs to be fully explained, it's that it needs to be explained a little bit, right? So, what I mean by like, make it not like Harry Potter. One of my problems with Harry Potter is the characters just learn spells throughout the books to just magic away their problems. Basically every problem they run into throughout the books, they just pull out a wand and then they just fix the problem, right? Okay? And then that creates world building holes later down the line. So say for example, in I believe it's the second book, Hermione pulls out a wand and she just Alohomora a lock. Open. Okay? Hermione's how old in that book? 13. Okay? Let's assume this is a world now, well, not assume, factually it has been proven to us now that this is a world where 13-year-olds can just unlock locks. So locks are just fucking useless, and yet the only thing stopping them getting into loads of places in Hogwarts is locks on the fucking doors. How the fuck does that make any sense? Really basic level shit like that. Now, I'm not saying that everything has to be explained, right? I've heard some people criticise the magic in Harry Potter to the extreme, to the point where some people will say, oh, well, I don't like the fire spell because where does the fire come from? It's fucking magic, bro, okay? Stuff like that is perfectly reasonable. Or I don't like the fact that they can just make water by flicking their wands. Where does the water come from? It's magic, bro. Also, it could be easily explained by it just pulling water vapor out the air or something. Anyway, my point is, my issue with magic is when it's just used to fix every fucking problem, right? In my experience, there's lots of books that do magic where it's not that well explained and it's quite soft. For example, the Dresden Files. The Dresden Files is my favourite series of books, and I go on about it all the time. The magic in those books, the characters can pretty much do whatever. That being said, the writer, Jim Butcher, is very good at being responsible with limiting what characters can do, so characters can't just do everything, even though in theory they could. Say, for example, Harry in the books, he's only good at certain types of magic, he can't just do everything. So he's limited to how he can fix problems, and he still has to use his wit, his intellect, and other means other than magic. Sometimes just pulling a gun out is just as good as throwing a fireball, right? And on top of that, in the Dresden Files, repeated use of magic exhausts the user, okay? That's what it's like in this book. This is what I like about it. So Bayaz will whip out the old magic and fuck some MFs up every now and then, but it's physically described that it exhausts it. I mean, when he immolates a bunch of dudes the first time we see him use magic, he's kind of described as being on the brink of exhaustion, and you can tell he can't really do anything else. Like, that's it. That's all of his juice in the tank is just fucking gone. And that's what I like about the magic in this. It's like, I know that Bayaz can use it to fuck shit up, and he can use it to do various things, but it's a get out of jail free card, like once a day kind of thing. He's kind of like a wizard in D&D that has one spell slot. That's basically how I imagine him. It's like, he can do one or two things like a day with this magic before he's out, and that's very much how it's presented in this book. And because of that, I don't really care how soft it is. Bayaz could basically do whatever the fuck, because it's already been established that when he does some serious mojo, he's done. He's donezo. That's all he can do. He can do some serious magic to help with the situation or get them out of a situation, but that's all he can do. He can't do anything after that. So the issue that I have with magic is completely gone in this book. I don't have any fear that the writer isn't going to use magic responsibly, and it isn't going to be used to undermine the stakes of the books. So I don't really care how soft it is in this case. It works really well. The mysteriousness of it, you know, I mean, it's pretty heavily implied how it works, right? Like, Bayaz talks about the fact that in order to use magic, you have to perfectly understand the thing that you're manipulating with magic, right? Which is why Magi all specialize in specific things when they learn magic. They learn as much as they can in their life about those very small specialized subjects. I think Bayaz's was will and fire, and he uses those two things to basically, the knowledge of those two concepts, to use his magic. There might have been another one, I don't remember. And in that respect, the magic feels limited. I don't expect him to go around doing random magical bullshit all the time. And also, it's been heavily stated that he's basically a shadow of his former self in terms of his magical capabilities. Same with the other characters who we see use magic. Ferro just kind of seems to have, I don't know if it is magic, but she seems to have some kind of supernatural powers. I don't know why she has supernatural powers, but she seems to have some kind of supernatural abilities going on, and those are grounded and they feel reasonable, and they don't feel like it's undermining the stakes of the story at all. And there's also, I can't remember his name, but the other Magi who gets Ferro out of Gurkish Empire, that guy, you know, he has some really cool powers. Like, he basically has obfuscate. He can make people not see him or not notice him as one other person, but he can only do that for so long before he's exhausted and he's tired. So it's not like he can really do much else. So, you know, I thought the magic in this book was really cool, and it added something, you know what I mean? It's like the right kind of soft magic, and I really liked it. I thought it was really good. That's all I have to say about the world building, the magic, and so on. Last thing I want to talk about that I really liked in this book, and that is the action. Obviously, I've mentioned the action a few times throughout the whole video in general. Joe Abercrombie is brilliant at writing action. The small amount of action that wasn't this book, most of the action was Logan. Oh god. Most of the action was Logan fucking people up. Specifically, again, that last action scene in this book that just goes on, and it's so well paced, it's so fucking hype, it's sick, and then Logan being taken over by the Bloody Nine at the end was fucking chef's kiss, bro. It was incredible. And then also just the contest as well. I thought the contest was really good with Jezal, and in general, the little action that is in this book just is so standout, and it slaps so fucking hard. Bayaz lighting people up, turning a guy into fucking mist. God damn, Ferro getting fucked up by the eaters. Every action scene in this book glows. It was brilliant, and there's no point me sitting here ranting about it anymore. 1 minute 30 seconds. That's all I need. The action in this book, it was fucking amazing, and I loved every second of it. God, I love this book. Man, I love this book. Anyway, the action. It feels like it. I've said this before. It feels like a Quentin Tarantino film as a book, and it just slaps so hard. It's brutal. It's perfectly paced. The description is phenomenal. There's nothing else to say about it, really. It's just brilliant. It's just really good. I really, really, really hope that the action stays strong in the next book, but I have no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that it will. The only negative thing I have to say about this book, and that is that the pacing could be a bit slow sometimes. That being said, the slow pacing, I think, is a product of the fact that this is a very character-driven book with a lot of different stories going on and a lot of viewpoint characters. So there are portions of the book where it doesn't feel like things are moving along, but they are moving along. It's just that you're going from the beginning of a part of a story to the beginning of a part of a story to the beginning of a part of a story to the middle of a part of a story to the middle of a part of a story to the middle of a part of a story, for example, and then, you know, it doesn't feel like it's progressing as fast as it would do. Either way, this book is one of the best books I've ever read, and I would not change anything about it. Nothing. I would not have anything changed about this book. I absolutely, thoroughly loved every second of it, and I'm so glad that I went back to go read it after all those years of it sat on my shelf. So, I'm going to finish this video off now. I rambled, and I rambled, and I rambled on about the characters, and just the book in general. I think it's pretty clear that I loved this book. I loved pretty much every second of this book. Like I said, I wouldn't change anything about it. And as I mentioned in the intro, this book has kind of got a special significance to me, because I did go through a period of severe depression in my life, and this book kind of signifies me mostly getting over that. I'm still depressed. I still have depression. It's never going to go away, but it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be. I have the odd day these days. Back then it was every day, and having gone back and read this book and having such polar opposite experiences, the experience I had with this book is I just didn't like it, and I found it boring the first time I read it. And I know why that is now. I was really, really severely depressed, and I wouldn't have found joy in anything in life. I didn't find joy in anything in life at that point in my life. I've gone back and I've read this now, and I'm in a better place in my life, and I loved every fucking second of it. This book, for me, was such a surprise, because I usually don't like grimdark stuff. I usually like things that are a lot more hopeful, a lot more light versus dark. I like things that are hopeful. You know, I like this like hope in the darkness kind of feeling. This book doesn't have this. It's very bleak. It's very depressing. And I loved every second of it. So thank you, Joe Abercrombie, genuinely, for writing such a phenomenal book. And this book will stay with me forever as Not just a book that I loved, but as something more. Something to signify perhaps a new chapter of my life. Thank you for watching if you got this far. I'm sure there's things I'll think of in the near future. I'll be like, oh, why didn't I put that in the video? But yeah, thank you for watching.